Hey everyone, we are talking today about quotation mark usage, and that will lead us into a discussion a little bit later about MLA citation. This is really important. This is something that we're going to be using throughout the entire school year. So if I'm talking too fast or you need to pause the video, please do so anytime. Please make sure that you can also go back and watch this again or watch portions of this again as well. So let's talk about quotation marks just in general. When do we use them? Well, first one we've already done. That's when we have titles of short works. We're talking about short stories, poems, song titles, articles, whether it's in a newspaper, online database, that kind of thing. Second thing is dialogue, which is what we're going to be talking about today. Third thing is when you're citing something using MLA citation. Again, we'll be talking about this very shortly. And finally, if you're trying to give emphasis to something, almost like somebody was giving air quotes, sort of offsetting a word. We're not really going to talk about that so much today, but those are the 4 times that you're going to use quotation marks. All right. So there's a word on the screen right now called attribution. And attribution is really, really important. It's a word that maybe you've never heard before, but I'm going to use it quite a bit. Your teachers in maybe middle school maybe used a different word. Okay. They may have called this a lead-in or something like that, but I'm using the word attribution. So what that means is you basically need to identify who the speaker is of the quote, or in some cases, the writer, if we're identifying a quote from a book. You need to tell me who it is. It can be as simple as he said or she said. Obviously, I'd like to make it a little more descriptive than that, but that essentially is the definition of an attribution. You must have that every time you have a quote. If you don't, it can get very confusing. Okay. And I have down there the last sentence there that a quote cannot stand alone as its own sentence. Okay. So there are 3 different types of attribution that we're going to talk about today. There's end attribution, which we're going to begin with. Then there's front attribution, and finally middle attribution. And the reason that they get split up is because they have different punctuation marks that are associated with each one. So I have on the screen right here 3 different types of end attribution. Okay, really simple sentences. This first one says, I have arrived, said Jack. That hurt, screamed Joe. Are you sure? Asked Mary. Now, notice the 3 things that I have circled. Let's go one by one. In the first sentence, I have the comma circled. Okay. If you have a sentence that you're quoting that is a statement, meaning it's not an exclamation and it's not a question, it would normally have a period. You do not use a period. You use a comma. Okay. So a comma would end your quotation, but your sentence continues on because you have to have the attribution. Who's saying it? So I have arrived, said Jack. So I use a comma instead of a period. In my second sentence, it's someone screaming, so I used an exclamation point. So you don't use a comma in that case. You would use an exclamation point, and then we have our attribution coming afterwards. In the third sentence, we have a question, so we use a question mark. Then we have asked Mary. Now, the reason I have the word asked circled in the third sentence is that word can be anything. Okay. It could be the word said. It could be the word screamed, asked, exclaimed. There are hundreds of different words. I'm actually going to give you guys later on a list of words that you can use instead of the word said, because the word said is kind of boring. I want you to use a word that shows me how the person says it. Okay. So we're going to get to that later on, but just realize that it can be any word, but in this case, we have the word said, screamed, and asked. So just write those sentences down, all 3 of them, just so you have examples of end attribution. So you can pause this video if you need to. Then we move on to front attribution. Front attribution is just taking the person said and moving it to the front of the sentence instead of at the end of the sentence. Now, not much changes, but some of the punctuation does. So I have the same three sentences, except I moved the front attribution. You move the attribution from the end to the front. So in the first sentence, I have Jack said, comma, I have arrived. Some things to take note of. You have a comma after the word said. Look at the other three sentences. There are also commas after the verb screamed and asked. Okay, so every time you have front attribution, you always have to have a comma. Then we have our quote, I have arrived. And then notice, and I didn't circle this on the slide, but notice that the period goes inside the quotation marks. That's really important. Okay, it goes inside the quotation marks. My next sentence, Joe screamed, I have my comma going right after the verb, and then I have that hurt, and then I have my exclamation point. That also goes inside the quotation marks. Now, I don't have an exclamation point and a period. There's no need for that because he's screaming it. The exclamation point is my end punctuation for that sentence. And then finally, I have Mary asked, and I have another comma again, and I circled the letter A in the word are. And it's the same in the other three sentences as well. Please make sure that you are capitalizing the first word of your quote. Obviously, in the first example, the letter I would be correct because it's capitalized always. But the word that in the second sentence has a capital T. The word are in the third sentence has a capital A. So you always start your quote with a capital letter when there is a comma coming before it, like after the word asked. Once again, I have my end punctuation. In this case, it's a quotation mark, and that is coming at the end of the quote, and it's going inside my quotation mark, my quote, excuse me. So I have my quotation mark after my question mark. So please take a minute and copy down those three sentences for examples of front attribution. So now we've done end attribution and front attribution. Okay, so now I have something to sort of throw into a wrench to throw in the works here. First couple examples have been pretty easy, but now I'm going to throw in the wrench of a colon. So in the other examples of front attribution, we had commas introducing the quote. In this case, we have a colon introducing a quote. So look at the first bullet point. I am quoting from a book called Food Rules by a guy named Michael Pollan. Okay, so I have this very long attribution at the beginning, front attribution. In Food Rules, Michael Pollan summarizes his extensive writing about food with 7 words of advice. And then I have a colon, the 2 dots that are circled right there. When you have a full sentence attribution, an attribution that can stand alone as its own sentence, you use a colon. If you just have a few words, he said, she screamed, whatever examples I gave before, that's not enough. It has to be a full-on sentence. So I could use that attribution listed there as a sentence, but instead I'm using it as an attribution. So I'm going to use a colon. All right. So I do my long attribution, I do my colon, and then I have my quote. Quote, eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Okay. And the same rules apply. I have my period go inside my quotation marks, but it's just a slightly different punctuation mark instead of the colon, instead of the comma, you're using a colon for this very long attribution that could stand alone as its own sentence. So please write down that example for using colons to introduce your quotes. All right, I'm going to make it even more confusing, okay? And that is that sometimes you don't use any punctuation mark. So we had examples before about using commas. The last slide was an example about using a colon. Now there's some that you don't use any. So the first example that I have there, the first bullet point says, the phrase, be that as it may, appears far too often in this essay. All right, notice there's no comma after the word phrase. There's no colon after the word phrase. It just goes right into the quote. And notice as well that there's no capitalization of the word be. Another example, the second bullet point there. In her closing statement, the prosecutor spoke forcefully of the defendant's callous disregard for human life. Again, no colon, no comma after defendants, no capital for the word callous. Our period does go inside the quotation marks, but sometimes it doesn't. Well, Mr. Fink, when would you not use any punctuation mark? Well, that last bullet point says no punctuation is used when the quoted material flows directly from your attribution. That's the way that the rule is stated in the Modern Language Association, MLA. They say it when it flows from your attribution. Well, what does that mean? To me, it means you could not just say the phrase by itself. Okay. You could not say in her closing statement, the prosecutor spoke forcefully of the defendants and then stop. You can't just stop. You have to keep going. Okay. But you don't need to pause. You don't need to take a breath in there. It can just go right into the quote. Okay. This is a little funky. So if you ever have a question on this, please ask me. Again, if you could copy down one or both of those examples of when you don't use any punctuation. Okay, moving on. We now have a third type of attribution called middle attribution. Middle attribution is when you have that he said, she said in the middle of the sentence. So we had end attribution first, we had front attribution, and then we had middle attribution. So here are three examples of middle attribution. Again, please take note of the items that I have circled. Okay, this is obviously the most complicated of all of them. So we have, I was thinking, comma, Lisa said, another comma, that this might not be a good idea. If you don't leave, comma, Mary screamed, you will be sorry. Do you think, Joe asked, that the Phillies will ever be good again? So the things that I have circled in the first sentence, I was thinking, comma, when you end the first part of your quote, you put a comma, and then you close your quotation marks. Then you have your attribution, Lisa said, and then you continue the same quote, that this might not be a good idea. In my second sentence, the part I have circled is a comma and the quotation marks when you start back up. So when you start back up your quote, you put another comma, you put more quotation marks to identify that there is more to the quote. And finally, in the third sentence, the thing that I have circled is the lowercase t in the word that. When you continue your quote, you don't need another capital. You need a capital beginning of the sentence, the word I, if, or do, but you don't need a capital at the end, when you restart your quotation. Okay, so you don't need a capital for that. You don't need a capital for the word you in the second example or the word that in the third example. Okay, those are the three important things about middle attribution. Again, it's the thing you could screw up the most because there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of punctuation, things you could mess up. Okay, but why is there three different types of attribution? Well, just for style purposes. We want to change it up so we're not doing the same one every single time. Okay, so therefore, there's three different types of attribution. So again, if you could please copy down these sentences for examples so that you could have access to those if you need to. All right, now we move into single quotes and double quotes. Again, this is difficult. I'm trying to make it simple, but sometimes it's not that easy. So here's about single quotes and double quotes. You're going to use single quotation marks to enclose a quotation within a quotation. What do I mean by a quotation within a quotation? Look at the example. That's the second bullet point. In that example, there are three people speaking. The sentence is, Jenny whispered, Mr. Fink just said, do the first three questions. There are three people speaking in that sentence. there's me, Mr. Fink. What did I say? I said, do the first three questions. The second speaker is Jenny. What did Jenny say? Jenny said, Mr. Fink just said, do the first three questions. Then there's a third speaker. The third speaker is some other person, whoever is saying this sentence. And that third person, the narrator, whatever you want to call that person, said that whole thing. Jenny whispered, Mr. Fink just said, do the first three questions. You can see why this is confusing. Okay? So the thing that I said, do the first three questions, is in single quotes. Single quote before do, and a single quote after questions. The thing that Jenny whispered is in double quotes before the word Mr. and after the word questions. It's confusing. My advice to you is try to avoid this. Don't do this. If at all possible, don't quote somebody who's then quoting somebody. It gets very confusing because what you're doing is, and this is in the third bullet point, is mixing a character's dialogue with the narrator's dialogue. You got to be really careful with that. It's really, really confusing. Again, if you could please just copy down that example for the correct way to do it. But again, if you can avoid that, that would be in your best interest. All right, so here is, the basics of everything. Periods and commas are always going to go inside of quotes. Colons and semicolons, which we didn't really talk about semicolons, but they always go on the outside of quotes. So whenever you have those are never going to go inside of quotes. Question marks and exclamation points, sometimes they go inside, sometimes they go outside. If they go inside, it's when it's part of the quote. If your quote is a question, it goes inside. If your quote is an exclamation, it goes inside. Otherwise, it would go outside. So in this sentence, it would go inside. The quote is, how do you get to the highway? Person's lost, phone's dead, they don't know how to get to the highway. So what that person asked was a question. Here's my example of when it does not go inside. Okay. Why did she say chillax? So the quotation marks are around the word chillax because that's what the person actually said. But I'm asking, why did she say it? So she didn't ask a question, whoever she is. I'm asking the question. So it goes on the outside. Okay. So again, little confusing. But I think if you think about it and you read it over, it actually will make sense. All right, we're on the home stretch here, guys. I promise. I know this video is going on a little bit long, but hang with me. The last part is the ellipsis. The ellipsis is the three dots. Okay. A lot of times people just throw these around kind of however they want to with no rhyme or reason. There are rules for these. So you need to know these. This is something you actually will use on occasion. All right, so let's go through it. So the ellipses is when you take something out of a quote. It could be a word, could be a phrase, a line of dialogue, or a line of a poem, could be a whole paragraph or more. And notice I underlined the words from the middle of the quote. From the middle of the quote. If you take out words at the beginning, don't need the ellipses. If you take out words at the end, don't need the ellipses. You only need the ellipses if you remove something from the middle of a quote. So here's what I mean. So here's my full quotation. Say in a newspaper, they're quoting somebody who's some sort of a politician. Today, after hours of careful thought, we vetoed the bill. All right, so that's the full sentence that the politician said. But I want to take out part of it. So here's what I'm going to take out. With the ellipsis, I'm going to say, today, we vetoed the bill. I'm removing after hours of careful thought. Today, we vetoed the bill. So I have my ellipses to take the place of all of those words that I'm removing. Again, those are removed from the middle of the quote. I have the word today in the beginning, and I have the we vetoed the bill at the end. So because I'm removing it from the middle, that's when you use the ellipses. Now, here's an example of when you're using it incorrectly. At the top, I wrote, it is not needed at the beginning or an end of a quote. You decide where the quote begins and ends. You only need it in the middle. So there's my full quotation again. Today, after hours of careful thought, we vetoed the bill. Incorrect example. You don't need the 3 dots if you just take out the word today. If you take out the word today, you don't need the ellipses because that's at the beginning. I can just start my quote with after. After hours of careful thought, we vetoed the bill. So I do not need the ellipses in that second example there. Okay, so again, please, if you could, copy down the example from this slide of it done correctly. And if you'd like to, you can also copy it down from this slide where it's done incorrectly. And again, as always, please pause this if you need to. Our last thing that we're going to talk about are called indirect quotations. Indirect quotations. You don't need quotation marks for these because you're not using the exact words. Okay, so here's some examples, just real quick. These are going to be super fast. Todd said that he was hungry. Lisa said it hurt a lot. She asked me if I felt well. None of those things are exactly what the person said. Okay, Lisa didn't say it hurt a lot. She might have said, when I got my, flu shot, it really left a mark. Okay, or my arm was in pain. Okay, the last sentence might be your mother or the school nurse or something. She asked me if I felt well. She didn't say if I felt well. She said, how are you feeling today? It looks like you're feeling sick. So you're not using the exact words. So because you're not using the exact words, you're not going to use quotation marks. So that's called an indirect quotation. Again, I don't even know if you need to copy these sentences down, but if you want to, you can. They're pretty simple. But if you need to, go right ahead. So here's where we're going to stop. We've gotten through the first half of quotation marks. We are going to start with MLA citation at a later date. Again, if you need to copy anything down, rewind, pause, go back and watch it from the beginning. You can do that to this video at any point. Thanks very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, we'll talk more in class.